Located in Washington, D.C., the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, or FABS, is a nonprofit coalition of 29 scientific societies and about 60 academic departments who are committed to advancing the understanding of the mind, brain, and behavioral sciences. FABS is proud to announce the Award for Inclusivity, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, or our IDEA Award. The FABS IDEA Award for Lifetime Achievement annually recognizes a senior scholar who exemplifies excellence in mentorship, service, and scholarship to advance the IDEA goals in the brain and behavioral sciences. My name is Robert Sellers. I'm the Charles D. Moody Collegiate Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan and a member of the FABS board. And I am extremely honored and delighted to welcome our 2023 IDEA Lifetime Achievement Awardee, Dr. James M. Jones. James, welcome today.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's great to share this moment with you, my longtime friend and adversary in a variety of domains.
For those of you who are unaware, there's a long-standing Michigan-Ohio State rivalry between the two of us,
Yes.
for which Michigan is up, just so you know.
They're up today, not in the last decade. Anyway.
that is true. That is true. Again,
So
James always bringing in history into his work.
Yes, right.
Well, I'm really excited about the opportunity to have this conversation today. And
Can I just say one thing before you go on?
Please, absolutely.
I just want to thank FABS and the committee for selecting me. It was a total surprise. Man, obviously, this is the first year, and I wasn't even aware there was such an award. And when you called me to tell me that I had received it, it was a total shock. And I'm really honored and pleased that my good friends are part of the process. And when I was in DC, I used to work with FABS on a variety of issues. So it's all good. I really am very honored and pleased.
Well, speaking for the committee, it really was, ironically, a no-brainer. More than epitomize what we hope the award would honor. So today we're going to basically have an informal conversation. I have a few questions I'd like to throw out and provide others with an opportunity to get to know you as well. So the first question is a basic question. So what first drew you to the field of psychology? And how did your experiences lead you to the study of racism as a focal topic for your research?
I was fortunate to take a course from Norman Henderson, who was a young new PhD who was a behavioral geneticist. And in his experimental psychology course, we did some things, and I really was turned on to the ideas of experimentation and science. And I did well in the course, and he invited me to work in his lab over the summer. Ran the experiments, transcribed some of the data, and it so turned me on that I decided in the fall to quit the football team and work in the lab, which angered angered the athletic director. But anyway, that was really the beginning of my career in psychology. And then Norm had a project with the FAA in Philadelphia through the Franklin Institute Research Labs. And I had just come back from spending the summer in Europe, and he invited me to be involved in that research project at the Oberlin FAA. And that turned into a job at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. So I moved to Philly. And while I was in Philly working at the Franklin Institute, I enrolled at Temple to get a master's degree. And then when I decided it was time to do the next thing, what really got me into where I was an article by Ken Clark in the New York Times Magazine about his work in Harlem. It became Dark Ghetto as a book, but I just said, wow, I'd like to be Ken Clark. And it turns out Claude Steele had the same aspiration. He too wanted to be Ken Clark. So I ended up going to Yale. They didn't have really any work on race or race relations or anything like that. Ended up doing a dissertation on humor. But this is 66 to 69. And in 1969, Chuck Kiesler, one of my advisors, asked me if I would be interested in writing a book on prejudice for a series he was editing. I thought he was joking. I mean, I was literally in my third year. I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. I said, I hadn't even started my dissertation yet. I said, okay, I'll try it. And so that was a book on prejudice, kind of following Allport. And when I got to Harvard, which was my first job, I got to Harvard and started to think about how to write the book. This is 1970, and things were very volatile, very explosive, very intense, and very real. So institutional racism and Black power and student movement, Black is beautiful. There was so much going on that I felt prejudice was timid, or it just didn't carry the energy and the fire and the need that racism required. So when I told Chuck that I really wanted to write about these sorts of things, he said, well, just change the title. So I changed the title from Prejudice to Prejudice and Racism. And so that's really how, it's through Ken Clark got me into thinking about going to graduate school and studying social psychology. And then with Chuck offered me to write this book, that really kind of launched my career.
So James, you're in telling the story, and again, knowing you as well as I do, you've been a mentor to countless number of psychologists, particularly Black psychologists, over the years. Could you expound a little bit with regards to those mentors who made the biggest difference in your life, and particularly in terms of helping you continue with your frame of trying to make psychology more inclusive, diverse, equitable, accessible?
Well, mentors, I mean, it's hard for me to distinguish mentors from colleagues because you work closely with colleagues and you learn from them, and they guide you and instruct you in certain ways. So in some respects, my colleagues are also mentors. My formal mentor, as I mentioned, Norm Henderson at Oberlin. At Yale, it was Chuck Kiesler and Bob Abelson, with whom I actually did my dissertation. And then as far as APA goes, Chuck ended up as executive officer at APA, and he's the one who hired me at APA to run the Minority Fellowship Program. And Dalmas Taylor was my predecessor as director of the Minority Fellowship Program. He got it started, and he laid important frameworks for how the MFP would operate that I took on and expanded and built. And then through colleagues like you, well, you as a recipient of the fellowship, but then as an advisory member and other advisory committee members, Sandra Graham and Fred Leong and many others, Wade Boykin, we grew it together. my colleagues as mentors are those particularly Black psychologists, as well as some of the graduate students that I worked with at Yale and at Harvard and elsewhere, all have contributed to the way I think about things. They've given me opportunities to expand on my ideas. They've supported me. So um, Wade Boykin is a good example. He called me up when Prejudice and Racism came out, called me up out of the blue. I didn't know him at all. He didn't know me, but he got my number, called me, and told me how much he appreciated the book, that it helped him to know that this kind of thinking was out there and that it sort of set a template for the kind of work that could be done. So Wade was very important. AJ Franklin and Frank Yates did the research directions of Black psychology, which was the occasion for me to write the first version of Trios. And so that was, again, it was interactive. And we reviewed and critiqued each other. We made presentations. So the mentoring is formal in some sense, but it's also very personal and very collective and very interactive. Wade Nobles was thinking about these ideas, Naeem Akbar, and we all were, Bill Cross, we were all thinking about ways to make our training in primarily elite institutions, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, Michigan, to make that training useful to our communities. And how can we as psychologists advance that? That was really an important part of my development and my thinking. And we had a real scholarly community that was also, in a sense, a brotherhood and sisterhood.
So, one of the things that is most exciting about your work, your original work on race and racism, is as you had mentioned, much of the field had focused more on prejudice and stereotyping at an individual level from the perspective of whites or other perpetrators of the experience. And your work on racism really refocused and recentered the nature of the work. And a major contribution was also advocating for a multi level perspective with regards to the study of racism. What was it like during this time period when you first began to stake out this particular approach, this kind of approach in a field in psychology that pretty much at that time was focusing on individual level phenomena?
The first edition came out, was published by Addison Wesley. And I remember my editor at Addison Wesley telling me that people who had read early drafts of it described me as that angry Black man. Now, you know me, I am not angry about anything. So, but the words I used, I thought were the appropriate words to use. And they interpreted that, as we do in our culture, a reflection of one's personality and one's character. They make attributions about what you're like and who you are. I wanted to reflect on race and racism and on the times we were living in from the vantage of social psychology, but I wanted it to be somehow reflective of the Black experience. And that required me to think about how I experienced and how people I knew experienced race and racism in their lives. Having living in a time when institutional racism was becoming a significant way of describing race relations, it necessarily meant you had to go up a level to understand how things worked. And the idea that prejudice and bigotry and bias, while important, did not capture the systemic nature, the automatic nature of how institutions function based on principles of discrimination that have been unfolding over 250 years. You had to have a way of thinking beyond intentionality and bigotry and attitudes to look at how all that has been built in to the ongoing ways in which our society works. But then there was another level that for me was the most significant, the culture. That institutions have a purpose, and their purpose is to realize the cultural values that define the identity of the people. And those cultural values were themselves laden with racialistic and racist notions. And so the institutions get constructed to carry out and to affirm those racist notions. And that it becomes automatic means that that cultural DNA is now transmitted through the institutions, through the psyche, into a perpetuation of inequality, disadvantage, disregard, and ultimately justifies oppression and discrimination. So that sounds pretty cool from 50 years later.
Right, right.
But I was 29 years old and hadn't even studied race at all. And to some extent it was an advantage because I didn't have any baggage. I was free. I wasn't trying to refute or confirm anybody's theories or ideas. I was just trying to figure it out as I went along. I understood that I couldn't begin to write about this complex set of issues without understanding how we got here. That's where the history came in. You can't sit down and say, okay, 1970, what's going on, and understand it. You got to understand that history and it's unfolding over time. So the model of the individual, institutional, and cultural racism is a bidirectional model. So it's not just that culture dictates institutions, which dictates individual psyches, but with experience and behavior, those psyches then begin to transform institutions, and institutions then make demands on cultural assumptions and values. So we are continually being influenced by culture at the same time that we're creating it. And the cultural change is incremental over time, and it's kind of cyclical. So the change goes on almost seamlessly until you realize, hey, it's different now than it was then. But you don't always experience it as a culture change in the midst of it changing. But you can look back and say, on the one hand, we're still the United States. We still have a constitution. We still have the history of slavery. We still have all the things that we know, but we're different substantially than we were then. But in some very fundamental ways, we're not. And trying to understand ways in which we're different, ways in which we're not, and the processes that allow us to evolve while also preserving that history. That's kind of the struggle I think we're in now. Some people want to preserve a false history, a false narrative, and others want to examine and interrogate that narrative so that we can change it in ways that actually end up being more congruent with what the original values were.
Well, so with that in mind, drawing on your experience as a director of the Minority Fellowship Program and the great amount of wisdom and knowledge and impact that you had, if you were speaking to psychology departments, institutions, organizations, what would you tell them are some critical steps to fostering a more inclusive and diverse scientific community?
a couple of ideas. One is we talk about anti-racism as if somehow if you just are an anti-racist, everything will be okay. We haven't translated what anti-racism means in psychology. And I think what anti-racism means is that it's a radical view. It's not just if you're not racist, then you're an anti-racist. It's a perspective, it's a direction, it's a focus that says things have to change in fundamental ways for us to achieve these goals. And I think of it as sort of critical, I call it critical anti-racism. And so that criticality is what's needed. And that's why critical race theory is so troublesome for people, because it lays it out there.
Mm.
And I think we have not exactly laid it out there in that way that says, you can, have your DEI, you could do this and you can do that, which is important. But if you really want to shake things up, if you really want to make changes that really fundamentally alter the rules of the game in ways that are more inclusive, you have to really uh, take some hard looks at things. And I know that you have talked about being human, and humanity is really the foundation of all of it. That we are all humans, as an anthropologist I heard talk once said, we're all cousins.
Mm.
And we're all offspring of African Eve, or whatever they
Yeah.
call that first person. And so we really are all descendants of that. And so we're all cousins in various dimensions. So how do we bring that together to create the kind of culture that is diverse in ways that benefit from that diversity? I think DEI has to take a view of how do we really pay attention to what people need and recognize that there are conflicts here. When we talk about being a welcoming environment for everybody, what's welcoming to one is not welcoming to somebody else. So where's the compromise? How do you manage it? And I think both and as a metaphor for two things being true, two opposites being true at the same time. I think of Niels Bohr in that regard. We have to start thinking in those ways, in different ways, that we're not pitting one against the other. We're sort of trying to put different and even conflicting things into a framework that allows each to be what they are, while also taking where they have commonality to make it strengthen the fabric of the whole community. I mean, it's not specific, but I think it's a mindset more than it is a specific set of practices.
Well, James, I'm afraid that we're out of time.
Okay.
As always, this has been a tremendous personal honor and opportunity. Again, I want to, on behalf of FABS, thank you for the tremendous contributions that you have made and the innumerous numbers of individuals you've impacted. You've greatly impacted my own career and my own ability to move forward as a psychologist. Would not have happened without James Jones. So
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much, Rob. Thank you for having me. Thanks again to FABS. And it's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you, especially. Thank you.